We are very much looking forward to having dialogue. As the organizer of this conference, such statements make me thrilled about the prospect of dialogue on hard issues, but also, to be honest, a little bit terrified. In any case, what I noticed about Alberto immediately during the symposium at WKU was that he is sharp, funny, not afraid to push the envelope, and able to get at the heart and core of an issue in ways that demonstrate the pervasive point that the world is a very complicated place. And to be frank, to demonstrate the point that we don't learn from our mistakes in the past. This is a result of the fact that Alberto has lived literally all over the world and has been a part of the American government's response to the events of 9/11 since the beginning. He's experienced and well-versed in the topic of this conference, and I look forward to seeing him describe the broad history of the United States and its treatment of the other in ways which will shed light on our current moment. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Fernandez.
Very much. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I can't think of a timelier topic for this yearly event than American Muslims and national security. This is an issue that we saw especially last year during the election, which has sadly all too often become a political football or litmus test used by one side or another. Divorced of context and nuance, the topic has often been used as a club, either to vilify or to signal one's virtue, often by people who know very little about either national security or about Muslims. It is my hope, if I can accomplish one thing, it would be that we could take on some of the easy notions that are out there and put them in much needed context. I am not a Muslim, but today I'm fortunate to be president of a US-funded corporation, media corporation, which has a very diverse workforce in Virginia overseas, and most of whose employees are Muslims. And I've had the good fortune of spending most of my adult life working on, or studying the Muslim world, particularly the Arabic-speaking Muslim world. Motivated by, the idea seems quaint today given the polarization, motivated by the romance of the East. When I was a young man, I joined the US Army at the age of 18, specifically to learn Arabic in the 70s, before all these issues that we're talking about were so hot or such a priority. Was able to study Middle East history and join the Foreign Service, and even though I served in Latin America and Africa, most of my career was in the Middle East, much of it spent in the field from Khartoum to Damascus to Kabul. I can literally say when I speak and think of Muslims and of the Muslim world that I've had every kind of experience and engagement with Muslims that one can think of. I have loved individual Muslims, I have hated individual Muslims, I've had wine with them, I've chewed khat with them, I've participated in Sufi zikrs with them on the banks of the Nile, I've watched Muslims paint and sing and act, I've had an Afghan Sufi peel an apple and feed it piece by piece into my mouth. And I've spent many hours, I think many precious hours, informative hours, arguing over bitter coffee or over arak, early in the morning or late at night, arguing and dialoguing about all sorts of things across the spectrum of the Muslim experience, from the most urbane and secular and skeptical to various types of Salafis and Islamists and others. What this means, and it should be obvious, of course, is that with dealing with Muslims, or American Muslims, or with any other large group of people, you will find anything and everything possible if you go looking for only one characteristic or worldview. One of the challenges we face in this discussion is the danger and the threat of generalization. And we see generalization and kind of the broad brush approach all the time. We see it all the time on the right, on the left, and in between. This is, I think, a real problem that we have when we want to have a kind of a serious discussion about difficult issues that are complicated and painful. One of the many tragedies of the hyper-connected world we live in is that simplistic, demonizing narratives are ubiquitous and so easy to propagate today. I think this is what President Bush, former President Bush this week, was alluding to when he talked about the danger and the risk of, when we have public discourse, of casual cruelty That is all too often what we see. I hope the following observations, I hope, will be helpful, and I look forward to dialogue and questions during that period. As I said, when we look at the issues of Muslims and security, American Muslims and security, I think we need to look at the bigger picture and put things in context. First of all, the Muslim experience in America, I would say, and here I'm referring to both immigrants and converts, is not that different than the experience of other new ethnic and religious groups in the United States. Questions of identity, questions of integration and assimilation, fear of the other are found throughout American history. This is nothing new. And while bigotry and xenophobia are nothing new, there's no doubt, I think it has to be said as a preface to this discussion, that despite all the problems we have, American society has been, if you look at the historical context and you look at it today, extremely tolerant. This is actually statistically provable. If you look at recent polls, American society is much more tolerant of others, including Muslims, than the much vaunted liberal societies of Western Europe. Tolerant Europeans. They're not like these crazy Americans. The reality is actually the reverse. I was just in Italy, and a recent poll in Italy showed that 70% of the population in Italy thinks that there are too many foreigners, too many migrants in Italy. And a larger European poll was held that showed solid majorities of people in Italy, in Germany, in France, in the UK, thinking that accepting Muslim refugees will lead to more terrorism. And indeed, the same poll showed the broad acceptance by European majorities of positions, very hardcore positions that would be extremely controversial in the United States, to say the least. Not only, of course, is the United States a tolerant place, despite all our problems, it also has to be emphasized or noted that ethnic and religious minorities in America do have more rights and are treated with more respect than non-Muslim minorities in the Muslim world. When you talk, as we have to, about the perils of alienation in American society, it's always good to have in the back of our mind to think of the alienations of non-Muslim minorities in the Muslim world, whether you are Yazidi or a Coptic Christian living in often brutal and intolerant circumstances. This is also alienation. As a Cuban American from Miami, I think there are two anecdotes. I like to combine the focus on the Muslim world or the Muslim context with non-Muslim things, because I think too often we kind of focus it in that very narrow way. Two anecdotes that I would offer from my own experience. A few years ago, there was polling done in the United States. Actually, it was at one point in 1980. One of these polls that are regularly done, which asked, what was the most hated nationality in the United States? And there was one point in 1980 when polling showed that the most hated foreign nationality or foreign ethnicity in the United States were Cubans. They briefly replaced Iranians in 1980. Now, this didn't happen because one day Americans woke up and decided to hate on Cubans. It happened because that year, as part of the flood of refugees, which were part of the Mariel boat lift, Fidel Castro had emptied Cuba's jails of psychopaths, rapists, and murderers, and these new arrivals, a very small number of the 150,000 people that came to the Mariel boat lift, had unleashed a shocking wave of brutal crimes in the United States. That blip in the polling data didn't last long, and Cubans were actually, once again, after a few months, replaced again by Iranians as the most disliked foreign nationality in the United States. A few years later, 1984, a young Cuban refugee named Eduardo Arocena, name that probably none of you are familiar with, was sentenced to life in prison for running an anti-Castro terrorist group called Omega 7. In Miami, you mention Omega 7 and everyone knows what you're talking about. You mention it here, nobody knows what you're talking about. This is a group that carried out at least 55 known attacks, mostly on Castro and pro-Castro targets in the United States, including 4 assassinations. Not surprising, some of the violence was directed against people in Arocena's own community. And to this day in Miami, you hear of campaigns to free Eduardo Arocena, unjustly convicted and serving, who has been in prison now for 33 years. These are recent events in the American history of new arrivals. But if you go back in American history, you can find all sorts of similar controversies and questions, issues of extreme violence or political action carried out by recent immigrants connected to events in the old country, and the reaction, often overreaction, by the locals. No matter what goodwill exists, and there is goodwill in America, I do believe that to be an immigrant, to be a minority, is to a certain extent to feel marginalized, is to feel adrift. I know growing up in South Florida, I felt the whole issue of alienation and feeling adrift from the larger body politic. I don't think that's bigotry or a condemnation of the United States. I think it is the all too human nature of the out-group and its relationship with the in-group. Understanding that this problem, this friction that exists between the new and the old, between the immigrant and the local communities, understanding that this is a problem common to us all, I think is an important step towards healing.